Dan's Worst Fights 1, provided by Casey.
Chris and Dan's Worst Fights 4, provided by me, Casey Schofield, and me, Riley Bailey. This tape has nothing but Chris and Dan.
Chris and Dan's Worst Fights was a story basically about two misfit young men. They were best friends, roommates, and they were thrown into a world and right smack dab in the middle of a war that they just did not understand and were certainly not equipped for. Chris and Dan's Worst Fights takes you on a journey of imagination, speculation. It was a story with a little bit of everything, honestly.
Well, sir, you see, we didn't really see the incident happen, but we think that Chris Marquise may have, another member of his family still out there.
Chris and Dan's Worst Fights spawned from an idea that I had as a child, maybe 3 years old. I used to have all these imaginary characters, and I thought one day, I was maybe 9, I could take these characters and I could make something out of them. I discovered that my little boombox at the time, just a little single tape player boombox, had a feature. You could record. And I took the only tape I had. It was an old ratty tape that partially worked and partially didn't. And I recorded my first installment of this audio series, Chris and Dan's Worst Fights.
The robot Casey is now activated. The robot Ken is now activated.
Basically, what this story was about was two guys who somewhat get along, somewhat don't. Chris comes off as kind of an arrogant prick in the beginning. And then you have the Casey character, who would be, I guess you would say, your noble warrior type.
The bad Caseys had Chris, and I went to save him. I mean, I care about him. I care about everybody, even though some people aren't nice to me at all.
Ken Sullivan, the character, was a sap, to put it in short. He was this overly emotional character. He was a very loyal guy, a very loyal friend, hell of a fighter, but extremely emotional. But he also had a comedic side.
I don't want Dan hanging out with my buddies anymore. He probably did this to you. And don't talk to me again. Try a fantastic slice of my chocolate candy pie. You'll feel better in no time.
His older brother Scott was a raging drunk. He was a raging alcoholic. In Chris and Dan's Worst Fights also, even though it was written in the mind of a child, I had an understanding of what trauma was, as much as I could anyway. I incorporated that into some of these characters to make it a little more believable.
Scott? You're drunk! Yeah! Scott, get over here! Sexy. Shut up! You're freaking drunk!
Dan Cauldron, the character Dan, he was essentially a crybaby. He was the world's biggest wimp. Dan was an explosive, emotional guy. You never quite knew where Dan was going to be at in his head, because you would confront him with something, and if for some reason Dan felt offended or upset by something, he would not just sit down and talk about it. He would burst into tears. And not just tears, mind you, but overblown, almost cartoon-like, pure childish baby tears. I mean, crocodile tears. I think the character of Chris Marquise was a very vengeful, angry young guy. Chris had taken revenge on his family, I guess from years past.
I feel so ashamed I could kill myself, but I'm not gonna kill myself. Stop fighting! You can't solve this by warring against each other.
I can tell you right now, Chris and Dan's Worst Fights would not have been possible without my brother and sisters.
Who are you? Chris. Oh, I remember you. Yes. You're not my arch enemy. I thought you were the bad rat there, Sarah. No.
Hey, Peter!
Hey, George, what's going on?
Nothing.
Shut up.
You've heard him say that a million
Now
times.
goodbye now. Couldn't afford to keep him. I'm just acting dumb.
When you got all of us together, it was comedy gold. Even as kids, you could definitely tell that we had something going, even if it didn't really make very much sense. You know, to this day, I still don't know exactly what Chris and Dan's Worst Fights was supposed to be about.
Yeah. Oh, what?
You coming to war?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
It was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun, and we definitely wouldn't have gotten where we are hadn't we scrounged my dad's tapes and dug around through old cassettes just looking for something to record on. But it meant that much to us. We loved to create, we loved to record, even if it was just playing around. All these years later now, I look back at Chris and Dan's Worst Fights and where I started, and it was just amazing because you think back to 1999, the technology was nothing compared to what it is now. I mean, back then all we had was imagination and sound effects that you could get maybe from a video game or toys or whatever. And now, I mean, it's all right here at your fingertips. I mean, 20 years later, it's just amazing. It's incredible how far we've come in such a short time, in just the past 2 decades. John and I always competed with each other. John Nation and I competed with each other from day one, years before our wrestling stuff even started.
We didn't even plan on competing against each other. That was not part of the plan. The plan was just to put 2 separate stories together because we love doing it.
John was a very good storyteller and exceptionally creative with sound effects. And I didn't necessarily have all the sound effects in the world, but I had all the imagination you could ever want. And we would just go head to head. No, mine's better. No, mine's better. John and I have always been fiercely competitive. And it showed in our 2 audio dramas.
The Evil Queen is going to get prisoners for the portal testing.
Oh no. You are the traitor of your own galaxy. You left them and formed your own. And now you're trying to take over everything that you possibly can.
I was sitting there with Johnny one day and he says, "Have you ever considered remaking it?" And I sat there for a minute and I was like, well, and I started to think about it. And I thought, you know, we have modern technology now. It'd be much easier and simpler to produce audio to make it sound more movie-like. When I was a child, that's all I wanted. That's all I dreamed about. I wanted this to sound real, but I just didn't have the equipment. I didn't have the technology, but now I do.
Ages ago, before Chris and Dan's Worst Fights ever was around, 10 million years ago, there was an evil plot to sabotage the world and destroy all its beautiful creations.
Chris and Dan's Worst Fights is how I started. I was a 9-year-old kid with a dream. I wanted to create. I wanted to be a writer.
That man is a visionary. That man is a genius at stories, at whatever he chooses to do. Because he puts everything into it.
I've been considering remaking Chris and Dan's Worst Fights for years. For maybe the past 10 years. Chris and Dan's Worst Fights, this time around, is going to be a full-fledged audio drama. I would like it to be in 3D sound. I'm working on getting equipment. Chris and Dan's Worst Fights back then didn't make a lot of sense. 20 years later, I want it to make all the sense in the world. I want it to be a full-fledged audio drama.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to Chris and Dan's Worst Fights 18. Just a reminder that this tape is a special 2-pack part tape. I'm the owner, Casey, and I hope you've enjoyed this series. See you later.
So I'm back again with a brand new Chris and Dan's Worst Fights tape. Welcome to Chris and Dan's Worst Fights 19. That's right, Chris and Dan's Worst Fights 19. It's been 3 years since 18 was made.
Chris and Dan's Worst Fights 20-year anniversary special, coming soon.